Top 3 Scariest Subway Horror Stories That Will Make You Think Twice. Story 1. The Man in the Tunnel. It was a regular evening. The subway platform was filled with commuters, most of them staring down at their phones, some lost in thought, others just trying to get home after a long day. But something felt off. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. As the train arrived, a man stepped onto the platform, his face pale, his clothes ragged. He wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes were wide, staring blankly into the darkness of the tunnel. He shuffled forward as if he didn't even see the train or the people around him. People moved aside, but no one thought much of it until the train doors closed. A passenger on the train noticed him, standing alone in the corner of the platform, still staring into the dark. His face looked like it had been drained of color, his eyes hollow, like he was somewhere far, far away. The train started moving, but the man didn't disappear from the window. The next stop was empty. No one was around except the passengers on the train. The doors opened, but instead of the usual hum of the city's nightlife, there was nothing. Complete silence. And then a low growl. A deep, rumbling noise echoing from the tunnel. People began to panic. The growl grew louder and something moved in the dark, something big, something unnatural. It moved faster than any human should be able to, its shadow stretching and stretching. A figure was growing, but it didn't look human anymore. It was something else. Something alive. The lights flickered as the creature emerged, its form terrifying, with long limbs reaching for the train. The passengers screamed, some running, others frozen in terror. And then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. But the whispers lingered, echoing through the empty station, and the last thing they heard was the man's voice. "They're coming for you too." Story 2. The Mysterious Passenger. It had been a long day and Jenna just wanted to get home. The subway car was eerily empty at that time of night, with just a few scattered passengers. She found an empty seat, exhausted, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up her spine. She noticed him the moment he entered. The man stood at the far end of the car, his face obscured by a large hood. The dim light of the train barely illuminated his figure, and it was impossible to make out his features. He just stood there motionless. He wasn't even holding onto the railing, as if the movement of the train didn't affect him at all. She tried to ignore him, but something about him made her uncomfortable. The longer she looked, the more she could feel his gaze on her, even though his face remained hidden. The atmosphere in the car grew colder, and every time the train slowed, it seemed like the air grew thicker. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. Then, as the train neared the next station, something unimaginable happened. The man started moving towards her, step by slow step. His steps didn't make any sound. No one else seemed to notice him. The train was getting emptier, the doors closing at each stop, but he kept walking. He finally stopped in front of her seat, just inches away, and his voice, deep and gravelly, whispered, "You shouldn't have taken this train." In a flash, Jenna tried to get up, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen, her feet glued to the floor. The figure reached out, his cold hand brushing her cheek as he leaned in close, his breath freezing against her skin. She could hear his whisper clearly now, "I've been waiting for you. You belong to us." The next thing Jenna knew, she was back on the platform, the train gone. And the world around her had changed. The streets were quieter than ever before, the city seemed abandoned. And in the distance, she heard a low, familiar whisper, "You're never leaving." Story 3. The Lost Souls of the Subway. It was supposed to be a quick ride home. Daniel had missed the last train, and the next one wouldn't come for another 30 minutes. The station was nearly deserted, only a handful of people waiting. He stood there, his eyes growing heavy with fatigue. The station was silent, the walls cracked, the flickering lights casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The only sound was the distant echo of the trains, far off in the tunnels. Then, out of nowhere, a man appeared. He walked up to Daniel, his face pale and twisted. His clothes were old, stained with what looked like dirt and blood. His eyes locked onto Daniel's and he began to speak, but his voice was low, guttural, and unrecognizable. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he felt them. The words crawled into his ears, into his mind, like a dark presence seeping into his thoughts. Before Daniel could react, the man's body began to contort, bending and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His limbs stretched unnaturally long, his skin rippling with something beneath it, something alive. The man's mouth stretched into a wide, unsettling grin, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. Daniel stepped back, but the man followed, his movements jerky and unnatural. Then Daniel noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the shadows, standing at the far end of the platform, were other figures, No souls, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, staring into the abyss. They weren't alive. They couldn't be. The man reached out for him, his hand cold and clammy, and whispered, "You've crossed over. You're one of us now." As the world around Daniel began to spin, he felt himself being pulled toward the shadows. The whispers of the lost souls grew louder, suffocating, like an endless chorus of the damned. Suddenly, the light in the station flickered one last time, and Daniel was gone. If you've made it this far, you felt it, the cold dread creeping up your spine. But this story isn't over. It's only just begun. The subway isn't just a place, it's a gateway. And now you've heard it. You've been marked. Do you dare to take the train next time? If you want to know more, subscribe now. Because you can never really leave once you've been touched by the darkness of the subway.